There we go. Hello everyone, and welcome to the AEBG TAP webinar, AEBG for Institutional Researchers, where our presenters will be Todd Hoig, Director of MIS at the Chancellor's Office, Randy Tillery of West Ed, and Neil Kelly of the AEBG Office. A few housekeeping items. When we close the webinar, an evaluation will appear in your browser window. Please take the time to fill out that evaluation. It provides AEBG TAP the information we need to improve future webinars, and it gives us an idea of what you'd like to see in the future. Next, the sound. I've been telling you this since we opened. If you are hearing an echo at any time, it probably means there are two browsers open. If you see your name listed twice in the list of attendees, that is definitely happening. The only fix is to close out all of your browsers and then come back into the room. Then the echo will disappear. If during the webinar your sound goes out, Adobe Connect does weird things sometimes, make sure the audio icon at the very top of your screen on the far left-hand side is green. If it's white or gray, just click it and that will make it green. You should be able to hear. If after all of that you still can't hear or something wonky is going on, please call TAP at 888-827-2324. That information is also in the important information pod on the underneath the slides. All questions for the webinar should be submitted in the chat pod. And now we're ready to get going. Neil?
Thanks, Melinda. Welcome, everyone. We have a large turnout today, and it looks like about a third or more of you are new to AEBG. So we will start at the beginning, talk about some of the legislation, talk about some of the new programming requirements this year that went into effect, how we got there, and then we'll dive deep into the technical details when we start talking about MIS and how we're working with MIS versus TOPS Pro Enterprise this year, and what we'll be looking to collect in 17-18 versus 18-19. So we'll get into those details. We have Todd Hoig and Randy Tillery, two experts in the field. Randy shepherded the field teams to making these policy decisions, and Todd is the MIS director at the Chancellor's Office. So these are the right people that we have here. I work at the AEBG office. I usually do these webinars, go out and do the training. So I'm kind of a familiar face to the people in the AEBG world. If you're new to this world, this is kind of a way of promoting adult education, lifting up non-credit. If you're on the college side, we're aligning with non-credit. We have a huge adult ed program at the K-12 and county office level that's aligning with non-credit. And so good things if you're a college person and are in the non-credit world. We're going to get better data, we're going to get metrics, we're going to get measurable skill gains, all that good stuff for non-credit that wasn't there in the past. So Randy will talk a little bit about that when he gets on. And so let's see if everybody's fine. Feel free to use the chat. We're up to about 77 people. I think we had 130 signed up. So without further ado, to leave enough room for questions, and we'll try to get to all your questions today if they're easy enough to handle, not specific to your community college and your operating MIS system, attendance system. If it's too technical, we'll have to take that offline. Okay. So with that, I'm going to bring on Randy, and I think Randy is going to turn his mic on, and there he is. So go ahead, Randy. We're on the first slide. Okay, we might be having some problems here. I'm going to, oh. Go ahead, Melinda.
Yeah, it sounds like he might be experiencing some technical difficulties. Randy, make sure that your microphone headset is not muted. There we go. And
unmute. Can you hear me now?
You're there, Randy. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't. I don't know. I had dropped out. So, So hello, everybody. This presentation is going to occur in two parts. I'm going to review the field team process from last summer and sort of some of the elements of what was decided last summer. I'm not going to go into depth on all of the metrics that are described in the reports of the legislature just because we have limited time today. I will say that all of those metrics are actually kind of parked at the back end of the presentation. So if you pull the PowerPoint down and you want to look at those, that's fine. But I will be referencing a report that provides much more detail about everything that I'm going to say here in just a couple of minutes. So WestEd was asked by the AEBG office, the CDE, and the Chancellor's office to come in and help facilitate a field team process last summer to help define basically the common metrics, the definition of the core adult education programs, and kind of data and accountability systems that would really kind of inform how we measure the effectiveness of consortia moving forward. And really, we look at the body of work related to data and accountability as being kind of iterative and something that builds over time, where we'll be able to track students longitudinally, and where we'll really be able to kind of have not only good reports to the legislature, but really a body of data and work that the field can look at collectively. So within your consortia, with your colleges and your adult school providers, you can use that data to inform effective practices and sort of how you want to grow and develop programs downstream. We really tried to, in this process, kind of go back to the core documents. We were kind of originalists in this process. So in AB 104, it defines kind of four things that were very germane to the work we did, one of which was to identify the common measures for determining the effectiveness of members of the consortia and meeting the educational needs in adults. That's kind of the core data and accountability mandate of the initiative. To align data that we collect as much as possible with reporting and data that we have to report for things like WIOA, Perkins, strong workforce. We really looked at all of the definitions in these other areas as we walked through kind of what we wanted to measure for adult education students. There's a part of the legislation that really says we need to kind of establish a common assessment policy, and that really around kind of how, revolves around how we assess student readiness in sort of math and English and spoken English, ESL, for the placement of adults into adult education programs and into college level coursework. Obviously, I think most of you are aware that AB 705 was actually signed this last month, which actually changes some of the statewide policies around placement and multiple measures. I'm not going to address that today, though we do recognize that that is sort of changing some of what some of the work we have in process related to assessment. And also to be aware that part of the mandates that the state agencies are operating under, they have to make 2 reports to the legislature after the end of every program year. A program year is from July 1st to June 30th. We have to make a preliminary report to the legislature by October 30th. That really identifies, what the preliminary enrollment and effectiveness numbers look like. And then there's an end of year report that is due to the legislature on March 1st of the following calendar year, and I will reference that a little bit as well, because that is where the much deeper data analysis will be, including data matching against things like the UI wage file, high school equivalency testing data, and things like that. And that will be the big data report. And this year will be the first time that report actually gets prepared with the full data set as described in the report we did to the legislature in August. My slide. There we go. So AB4 requires, hello? Now I'm going back. It's touchy. So AB4 requires really kind of 7 core data elements, one of which is just in general, we have to identify adults served by the consortium. And that includes what we're calling, in this case, a reportable individual, which is anyone who receives 1 hour or more, 1 contact hour or more of direct instruction or of services. And so we're actually aligning to the WIOA definition under that. We understand that the sort of 1 hour sort of criteria is new for colleges and creates its own kind of challenges for data collection. How do you identify who those students are? Are they enrolled? Are they meeting with a counselor? And so we've been working with the consortium in terms of helping them think about how they actually gather information about those students. Secondly, there are a number of outcome measures that the legislature requires, and that the adults actually demonstrate improved literacy skills, completion of high school diplomas or equivalents, so that's like GED, TASC, HiSET, completion of post-secondary certificates, degrees, or training. And I will say, just as a side note in relationship to this, and this, if you look at the metrics in the report related to transition to post-secondary or post-secondary credential completion, post-secondary includes adult school, K-12 adult school CTE programs, because many of them are accredited vocational post-secondary institutions and are eligible for Title IV funding. So they are basically recognized in the eyes of the federal government as post-secondary, and so you need to look at those definitions in the report and when you're trying to think about this sort of transition to post-secondary and things related to that. Placement into jobs, improved wages, and then the transition to post-secondary, which I just mentioned. So just a couple of notes about the process. We basically recruited people from K-12 adult schools, community college credit and non-credit programs, CDE, the Chancellor's Office, and the California Workforce Development Board were involved in the process. Process was present because they are the provider for TOPS Pro Enterprise, which is one of the major data collection tools being used, as well as for the CASAS testing instrument, which is used for pre and post testing for English, math, and ESL, particularly for the K-12 adult side or WIOA Title II funded practitioners. We divided up into 3 teams. There was a primary data and accountability team that took responsibility for kind of crafting and improving the bulk of what's in the report related to the core metrics and the data systems. We also had a basic skills assessment team and then a CTE team to grapple with issues related to those domains as well. We had 35 field participants, identified the folks involved. It was literally, we started meeting in May. I mean, literally, I think we got a phone call related to this in April at WestEd. We started meeting in May, and we actually had 40 hours of meetings in May, June, and July, which resulted in a report to the legislature on August 1st that really defined the metrics, the data systems, and the programs for adult education moving forward. The white papers, notes, and agendas were all published on the AEBG website. That sort of little infographic there just shows kind of the meeting schedule, just so you can see kind of how it kind of mapped out. We use a variety of references and resources, and let me also, I'm going to backtrack for a second and say that all of those white papers, the notes, and the agendas are all published. So if you actually Google AEBG data and accountability, you will go to the field team website and you will actually see, you can pull down any of those papers. So in related to questions like for a common assessment, you can pull that paper down and see all the reference materials we use to actually inform that discussion. This shows some of the text and resources we use to inform the discussion in the committees. And this kind of represents how we were trying to be cross-disciplinary and really cross-system. We went to the originating AB 86 and AB 104 legislation. And while AB 104 created the Adult Education Block Grant Program, it was really AB 86 2 years earlier that kind of really started all this rolling. And the AB 86 legislation and the definitions that are there still really hold and apply to the construction of the program moving forward. There was a 2012 LAO report that really set the framework for this kind of new regime of having colleges and K-12 adult schools work together collaboratively in terms of defining what adult education should look like statewide. We looked at WIOA, we looked at the OPTE guidelines, the College and Career Readiness Guidelines. We looked at the National Reporting System, which defines the course testing and the educational functional levels for English, math, and ESL. The Title IV Federal Student Aid Guidelines for what counts as a post-secondary institution. Council on Occupational Education, which is the primary accreditor of adult schools who are actually accredited for Title IV funding. And then there's also an implementation report related to AEBG put out by Classman. If you're going to read 2 documents, I would recommend that you go to the AEBG website and pull that document down, as well as the Measuring Our Success document, to really kind of understand the lay of the land in terms of both the current policy environment and where we think policy is going in the future. So this just shows the field team website. I'm not going to pause there. I probably should have done that slide one earlier. So this is actually the report, and so if you actually, once again, Google AEBG Measuring Our Success, you'll go right to the page where that is. It's actually not excessively long. It's like 26 pages, and it really covers in much more depth all the things that I'm going to talk about here. So it does a couple of things, one of which is it provides program definitions for the 7 program areas described in AB 104. Those program areas were not defined in AB 104. They're just described there as allowable uses of funding. So what part of the work of the committee was providing better definitions of what those programs are, and sort of what counts and what doesn't count in each one. Secondly, it was the data elements themselves. Here are sort of the kind of the highlights from that. What are the reportable programs for AEBG? What is the difference between a reportable individual and a participant? How are we defining a measurable skill gains in adult basic education, adult secondary education, and ESL programs? We defined a couple different ways to do that, one using the NRS testing, pre- and post-testing instruments, one using the CB21 levels below transfer. Program transition, like looking at students who just change programs, and what does that mean? Progress to diploma, post-secondary credential completion, occupational skills gains, which is new, which the committee took on because they wanted to have a way to maybe kind of count students who are progressing along a CTE pathway but who have not completed a certificate or credential. You can think of this as being sort of the adult education equivalent of skills builders, which has become an important metric to the colleges in recent years. Workforce preparation for students who are only doing kind of workforce readiness programs, post-secondary transition, then employment and wages. So this is really what's in the report, and once again, I'm strongly urging that you go in there and look through the metrics. Also, the metrics are identified and the program definitions are there in a very abbreviated version at the end of the PowerPoint. I might refer to that if we have some questions related to that and have time at the end of the presentation. So just to clarify, as Neil was saying, is that we're really focused on kind of 2 populations in the reporting for adult ed and AEBG, and it's not. When we say reporting, basically it relates to the reporting obligation the providers have. It doesn't mean that we aren't tracking students in other areas. So we're looking at adult education students enrolled in any of the 7 AB 104 program areas at a K-12 adult school, a community college non-credit program, or in a third-party provider supported by a consortium for the purposes of providing training or supportive services. Now, that is in there because a number of consortium, particularly some smaller rural consortium, are contracting with CBOs or libraries or other entities to provide either instruction or services to students. And that's just to make it clear that the consortia have reporting obligations related to those students, even though they may not be actually enrolled in an instructional program at either a K-12 adult school or a non-credit program. And this includes all students regardless of funding source. So last year there was this approach which really was looking more at the students who were sort of touched by AEBG, the ones that were direct funded. The clear intent of AB 86 and AB 104 is to focus on the capacity being built for the $500 million that's being invested by the state in adult education, not just the $500 million itself. So we're really trying to focus on the systems that are being built and the leveraging of apportionment and other resources as part of the larger body of work moving forward. And I want to say that the intention is not really to ignore students enrolled in 4-credit programs, and we'll actually be capturing enrollment for students enrolled in 4-credit programs as they transition from non-credit programs or from K-12 adult schools into 4-credit programs, and we'll be doing data matching to report that. So we will be pulling data related to what students do in 4-credit programs. We're just not requiring the entities to actually have to report on those students. So the reporting systems, there's actually a shift going on. I think many of you are aware that this last year and in 2017 and 18, we're reporting all the students using TOPS Pro Enterprise, which is a product of CASAS for collecting unitary student data, which is then reported up to the Chancellor's office for reporting. And it's a way of both collecting enrollment and outcomes. There is a data entry record and data update record for students. I know that many of you are living within the process of trying to do those data extractions currently. The AEBG office has done a really nice job of identifying colleges who have been able to do those data extractions and pairing them with colleges who are struggling with the process to help facilitate that for this year. The good news is that really beginning in 2018-19, our intent is to extract the data directly from MIS. and not to require reporting into TOPS Pro Enterprise except for WIOA Title II providers. So CDE controls the WIOA Title II reporting process, and so that basically, and that's all governed under the National Reporting System and the Department of Education. So they have specific reporting requirements that have caused them to kind of make the choices they have made. What we're trying to do is for colleges, generally we're trying to say, well, let's actually make this work within MIS and create the MIS fields that we need to be able to do this so we can pull the data directly out of MIS. Now that does not change the fact that there's data that we're collecting about students that may not be part of what you're getting now, and so the providers, and particularly non-credit programs, will have to think about how to collect some of that data, and we've had some of those conversations with them. The other component of this is that we're going to be doing basically displaying, aggregating and displaying all of the data in the launch board. I'm presuming most of you are familiar with launch board. So there is a build out of an adult education data dashboard. So the first build out happened a year and a half ago. West Ed worked with a couple of adult ed consortia. I was still at Contra Costa Community College District at that time, and one with one of those two consortia. So that will roll out in the second build this winter and spring. So you will be able to look at the display of your consortia data this upcoming calendar year. The system components, just to kind of lay it out, there's really kind of three pieces. One of which are the tools for reporting and collecting the data, TOPS Pro Enterprise and the MIS system. And then once the data is all uploaded into the launch board, then we'll be doing a variety of data matching to really fill out the data set. So we'll be matching the K-12 adult education students against the college MIS data to identify students who transition either from K-12 adult into non-credit or credit programs, including anything that they accomplish there. We'll be matching to the EDD wage file. We'll be matching to the high school equivalency testing data, so the GED, TASC, and HiSET data. And we actually have access to the Division of Apprenticeship Standards data, so we will be able to identify students who transition into apprenticeship as well. That's actually kind of grayed out here just because that sort of got added into the mix late, and we haven't actually figured out all the mechanisms for that yet, and you may not see that reflected in the data element dictionary that we produced for this. The data visualization will happen in the Launch Board Adult Ed Data tab. This is sort of the flow of what that looks like. What I've done here is identify, and this was sort of to help us as a kind of a state level team identify where the data matching happens. There's actually data matching that has to happen for WIOA Title II reporting because the deadlines for reporting that data to the feds occurs much earlier than our deadlines for reporting to the legislature. But this just sort of visualizes that TOPS Pro Enterprise and MIS will be the primary reporting mechanisms. There's data matching that happens for WIOA Title II, and then master data matching at the end of each program year. So the data that we end up that ends up showing up in the launch board will be the data that goes into the end of year report to the legislature. That will be aggregate level data. So we're not outing consortia or consortia members necessarily. The primary consumers of consortia or member level data will be practitioners. So you'll have access to data in the launch board for adult ed consortia exactly like community colleges have now. They'll be looking at their own data and using that to inform local conversations and planning for the future. So you'll be able to see comprehensive consortium and member data, disaggregated program, demographics, barriers, and other criteria. There actually are other metrics that you'll be able to see, so not just students who it won't be just reporting on the primary metrics. You'll be able to see students who transitioned into a 4-credit program, even if it was a developmental ed program and isn't a transfer level. There is a data element dictionary also available on the AEBG website that identifies not only every single data element, but also identifies the MIS coding for those elements. And so I think for this audience, in particular researchers, we would highly recommend that before you pepper us with questions about specific elements and what they mean and how they're defined and where does it sit in MIS, that you take a look at that. There are still areas where we're defining things as questions come in. We encourage you to submit those vis-a-vis the AEBG website, and they usually get referred over to me or to Jay Wright at CASAS to respond. But I would highly recommend that you review the document first before asking those questions. We're doing the test matching this fall. Data will be available in spring. We're having conversations right now about having sub-regional training with consortia when they first see their data to actually look at how they can use that data for effective decision making and program planning. So there's some discussions moving forward about that. Some other activities, and then we're going to move over to Todd. It was identified that there might be things that we want to explore or research that we want to do that's not related just to the primary reports of the legislature. The Data and Accountability Committee strongly recommended that we create a yearly supplemental data report to do things like, say, a deeper dive on how adult ed students are being served in 4-credit programs, investigation into certain kinds of effective practices like immigrant integration or integrated education and training. And so we're actually having a meeting next week to actually put some meat on the bones of that. That actually will look a little bit more almost like a research publication, we're thinking, than actually a report. And it's going to be about identifying research questions for the field and working with entities like RP or PPIC or folks who actually are in this space to figure out kind of how we kind of stand up research projects to actually move effective practice forward. Todd's going to talk about the additional MIS elements. Those are all moving forward. We're having conversations about right now retooling CCC Apply to actually make it more useful for serving non-credit students. There are structural challenges with it currently. And we're doing a crosswalk of the National Reporting System, the CB21 rubrics, actually inform kind of local multiple measures conversations. So that is my part of the presentation. I see some people said they couldn't.
No, you were fine.
I'm
you were fine, Randy.
People were able to hear most of it.
I think that was earlier. Hey,
so,
Randy, we do have a question. Are you ready for a question?
Oh, okay.
Randy?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, a quick one. So on the field teams, there was a question.
A quick one? Sure.
Right. Can you hear me,
Yes.
Randy?
Neil?
Okay, so on the field teams, the question
I
was,
can hear you.
how come there wasn't any researchers included on the field team? Because they're the ones that are, implementing the data collection process and this and that. And so when the policy comes down, they're the ones that have to implement it. So that was kind of the question, and you can just respond with the logic and the time frame and all that stuff that we had to deal with this summer.
Well, so there, it was not true that there were no researchers involved. So there was one who participated in the CTE field team. So there was a very tight time frame for identifying who should participate in the field teams. There was a strong preference from the field that so to the non-credit and then the college and the K-12 practitioners that these be individuals who actually have to work with students. So in terms of identifying what we wanted to measure, that was really the primary consideration, because it was very, very touchy for folks in terms of how this is going to get rolled out and that it be useful to the folks who actually are working with students. So Kathy and myself were the primary facilitators of that process. Kathy obviously works very closely with the research community and with the MIS and the launch board. So part of our role were to take questions, and Kathy did reach out to some researchers and practitioners on the research side to get feedback on certain processes related to that. I do think there are processes moving forward where we want a much stronger research presence, like this supplemental report that we're going to do. I think it needs to have researchers engaged in that. I will say it was very tricky to sort of actually populate these teams and have them be sort of, have them.
Randy, so one quick question before we move on to the next one. So Steve asked, how do we address non-credit students who did not enroll through CCC Apply? What's your advice on that, Randy?
So my understanding of this, because we're actually taking on this issue at a state level, is that I think 40% of non-credit programs don't use CCC Apply for enrolling their students. They collect the information using paper forms, and then they actually put the data into MIS themselves. So my understanding is that's the process that colleges are using where they're not using CTC Apply for students currently. I would say that if non-credit practitioners would like additional guidance related to what that looks like, there are actually, programs like Mount SAC or like Madeline, I know would be happy to sort of take on a TA role and kind of share their process with you. So I kind of want to move on to Todd here, so we get through his part of the presentation.
Okay,
and
thank
really
you.
Kind of open up more for questions before we get too far along.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Freddie. Thanks, Gil. Just to briefly go through some of the proposed changes that to the MIS data submission to enable the reporting for AEBG and the ledge report and that federal requirements for reporting. So we're in the process right now of finalizing those data element definitions, and we are hoping to release those soon to the field via memo. These changes are going to take effect for next year's reporting. That would be the first term that would be reported with these new definitions would be summer of 2018. So the 18-19 year, as Randy showed in the slide earlier, would be the first year where this data would be collected through MIS. So I have a couple slides, just a summary of the proposed changes, and as you'll see, there are a few amendments to some existing elements, and then we have a few new elements that will mostly go into our special populations data collection to help define some of these students. So the first one would be amending the current SB 23 student apprenticeship status element, and I'll go into each of these in detail of the actual change. So that's just an amendment of an existing element. We would be adding a new element to the SA, that's the student assessment data collection, and that will address the educational functioning level of the based on the assessment. A few more changes. We'll be amending one existing special populations element, and that would be the current SG10, which is Student Career Advancement Academy status for student. And then there will be a set of new special populations elements. So these are going to be the bulk of new elements that we'll be adding. And those will address different student characteristics such as economically disadvantaged students, ex-offender students, students who are homeless, students with who were identified as long-term unemployed at the time of entry, students with cultural barriers to employment, seasonal farm working students, the student literacy status, and also work-based learning students. So I'll go through each of those briefly, the changes that to the elements. So the first one was amending the current SB 23 student apprenticeship status. And this element is an element that defines students who are registered apprentices or in approved pre-apprenticeship programs. The change would be to add a new valid response, a new code here, which would be identified as code 2, and that would identify students who are participating in a pre-apprenticeship program approved by the Division of Apprenticeship Standards through an MOU. The next change would be a new element, and this is the element we'll be adding to the SA file, and it would be SA07 Student Educational Function Level. And this is going to be to define the educational functioning level of a student based on the use of a federally approved assessment. And you can see these are the proposed valid responses here. So they deal with different types of assessments, federally approved assessments, and the responses based on those assessments. So in cases where the assessment qualified for one of these educational functioning levels, that would be the response. Otherwise, there's a code N for in the case where these are not federally approved assessments. The change to the existing special population element SG10, the student CAA status, and this is for reporting the whether or not the student was a participant in a career advancement academy. The Career Advancement Academies are we're weaning away from those, but there's still a need to report students who are going to be included as participants in integrated education and training programs that meet federal standards. So we are adding a new code here in addition to the non-CAA student and CAA student codes, there's a new code 2 which will identify those students who are participating in EIT program. And now these are the set of the new elements that are going to be added to the special populations file. First one is the SG14 student economically disadvantaged status. So this is going to indicate the status of economic disadvantage of the student. And there's this is similar to the economic disadvantage status that's reported in the VITIA SV file with additional valid codes to further break those out. So if you're familiar with the SV element, there are the first three, the recipient of CalWORKS, TANF, or AFDC, or supplemental security income, or general assistance. Those are the same as mapped in the SD element, but we've added, there's 4 more additional economically disadvantaged statuses now to be reported here for a little bit more detail. SV15 would be student ex-offender status, and this element will indicate whether the student had been subject to any stage of the criminal justice process, and that's at the point where they were enrolled in the program. So either this is just a yes or a no, so A if they were, and if they were not. SG17 would be student long-term unemployment status. And this is going to be whether or not the student had been unemployed for 27 consecutive weeks or longer at the point where they were enrolled. It's just a yes or a no. So these both are just set these once, and they won't change term to term. They are basically just at the time of enrollment in the program. SG18 would be the student cultural barrier status. So this one is indicating whether the student perceive themselves as possessing attitudes, beliefs, customs, or practices that would influence a way of thinking, acting, or working that could serve as a hindrance to employment. And that's if they had that belief or had self-perception at the time they were enrolled in the program. The SG19 would be a student seasonal farm worker status, and this is just capturing whether or not the student was a seasonal farm worker at the point where they enrolled. SG20 would be the student literacy status, and this is going to indicate whether the student had a low level of literacy at the point where they enrolled. So these are basically just special populations we're going to be using. These would be used to identify students who were members of that group that identified that way. And SG21 is the student work-based learning status. And so this is an element that indicates whether a student participated in a specific work-based learning during the term. So in many of these other new SG elements, they were at the time of entry into the program. This isn't actually going to be updated on each reporting term, and it's whether or not the student participated in a specific type of this work-based learning. So you can see there's 3 different codes there to identify the type of work-based learning that the student participated in. And that's it for the elements. We are currently, as I said, we're currently working on finalizing those and getting them into the DED format, and they should be released with a memo to the field.
So Todd, you have
maybe the next month or so.
Time for one quick question. It seems like it's a big one in the chat that maybe you could answer. Okay, so Betty asks,
Sure.
So the new SG element collection, are you suggesting these will be added to CCC Apply, or can colleges ask these questions on their own local supplemental application? And so then people add in, is this all a self-report? Does that mean the data is not going to be very good? not very reliable if it's self-reported. So if you could respond to that, that would be great.
Yes, so right now I know that some of these elements are not being captured in CCC Apply. I know that there is an effort going on to work with CCC Apply to increase the use between CCC Apply and AEBG. So some of these may be added in the future. As of now, they are, it's my understanding that these are all being collected by locally, and they would be able to be reported through the regular MIS process, whether that's coming through a paper form when the student is applying to the adult ed program, or in some other way, some other electronic fashion. But it's my understanding that these are being collected.
Randy, I would just add that that's exactly the discussion I think we're having.
We can't hear you, Randy.
So this is exactly the discussion that's happening right now regarding CCC Apply and the best way to kind of provide guidance to colleges to collect this information that we feel is going to give us good information to go by. The categories that have been added are all aligned to WIOA definitions, populations that we are supposed to be tracking. The recognition, there's two things going on, one of which is that we can't add to CCC Apply infinitely and expect to get all the data, but if we're going to say this should happen to a supplemental data collection system, then we need to kind of provide guidance about the best way for local providers to do that.
Okay, there are some other questions, but we can plow on and see if we can get to some of these at the end.
Okay, next we're going to cover some of the MIS reporting issues that have been identified. Did you want to do this? Or okay.
A little bit of background. So TRIS actually pooled non-credit enrollment data going back to 2011, 2012, using the current AEBG program definitions. So through that process, issues were identified in terms of how certain things were being coded or reported or not reported. So a couple recommendations have emerged from that process. And what I'm reporting here is something that's sort of been compiled by the RP group, and I translated into slides, and I can go through them very quickly. One of which was that we had non-credit sections for which students had grades, but we actually didn't have any contact hours, which was creating an underreport of the overall student population. And so the recommendation for that was to be sure that contact hours are reported, that SX05 is populated for all students where there are enrollments in those sections, that all sections have an instructional method assigned, and we're strongly recommending that non-credit programs review the MIS processes for all of their non-credit sections to ensure that this is happening. You know, some of the issues here is that this applied to about 15% of non-credit sections, so it's statistically significant between 2011, 2012, and 15, 16 that were missing instructional methods. This directly impacts the tracking of enrollment, student progress, and FTES in the launch board. Nice typo there. And with the legislature. The legislature specifically is asking a lot of questions about the number of instructional hours that students are participating in. So it's important that we have that data moving forward. So the next issue was that there were clearly two different ways in which ESL courses in particular were being tracked, and so we had to make some decisions about the best way to code those courses and how we're going to pull data about student participation in ABE, ASE, or ESL. Decision currently, because it seems to give the better data and the better student count, is that we're going to derive participation in those courses from CB22. And we're only going to use CB21 to distinguish ABE from ASE courses, so adult basic education from adult secondary education, and those levels are being defined according to the crosswalk and the rubric that's being developed right now. And we actually know what those are, and I don't have a slide here that captures them, but that'll be in part of the guidance that actually goes out to the field. And so similarly, we strongly recommend that colleges review the coding of their ABE, ASE, and ESL courses, particularly the CB22 and the CB21 codes. We're not getting as good a data, and I think this is correct. Todd can correct me. When students are using a combination of top code and CB21 for those courses, the data is not we're not getting as strong a data from that. So those are the primary recommendations related to, and these are the statistically significant coding issues we saw that were impacting the reporting student numbers for non-credit programs. And that's really sort of, I think, it in terms of, yes, so we're not going to go into programs because we don't have time for that, but this would be the kind of time for questions.
So Randy, let me, we'll start with where we left off. There was a question about student cultural barrier status. Is there an example of what this might be, or is this something that's self-reported? They just need a clarification on that.
That's self-perceived.
I think it's self. So that actually would be a good question to be sure gets to us vis-a-vis the TAP, right? So that we can actually dig in on that a little bit more. So I think some of these definitions, as I'm looking at them, when I see them actually in the MIS definition, I'm seeing that we probably need to kind of dig in and provide additional level of guidance. I think it would be primarily self-perceived.
Okay. So a question that is popular out there, if MIS is going to take over reporting, do you have a crosswalk to set up these? Can you share it and make things a little more consistent between colleges? I guess this would be a crosswalk between TOPS Pro and I don't know if someone could.
So that crosswalk is actually in the data element dictionary. So if you go to the DED that Kathy and the team created, it's been vetted with the RP group and with Chris here. That it includes for each AEB adult ed data element, it includes the MIS coding and the TOPS Pro coding for that element. Now the coding in TOPS Pro can be a little more complicated in some cases, and so where there are questions, we're happy to hear them, and actually we can ship those over to ensure that we're giving the right answers in all cases. Those were vetted.
And then Randy, if they are just importing, exporting to TOPS Pro, they should probably use the TOPS Pro data dictionary to upload directly into TE. That seems to be the process that CASAS is suggesting just for this year to upload from their local MIS system. So that would be different than, crosswalking over to MIS for the launch board.
Yeah, I am not a savant in the idiosyncrasies of the data extraction process. That's sort of outside of my normal domain. So I think we're just going with CASAS guidance relative to that right now for that data extraction, because they're the ones who have dealt with that previously. And then, we know that there will probably be when we transition to MIS, there'll probably be some differences in the data that we see this year when people are extracting than more actually when we're pulling directly from MIS. The legislature, in the reports that we're doing for them, have been very clear about the fact that this is an evolving process. There's going to be some shift in the numbers. I think we're baselining this year with much better numbers than in previous years. But then starting next year, we'll really be able to norm the non-credit enrollment based on what we know, what we actually have.
Okay. Yeah, because the comment was the Chancellor's Office MIS codes aren't exactly aligned, so it's up to each IT research office to make professional judgment about that alignment between the CASAS data and the MIS. So more to follow on that. There was a question about student educational functioning levels. How would they know that? And I think, isn't that coming soon, Randy?
Well, so the EFLs apply when, as a provider, you're choosing to use a national reporting system approved testing instrument to assess student skills. And so it would be the rubrics for those are specific to, the cut scores for those are specific to the testing instrument. So CASAS has their own cut scores related to that. So if you're, And so if you're using pre and post testing and you want to report that data and those outcomes, and those elements will allow you to do that, and you should know that from the student test scores using that test rubric, all of which are supposed to be aligned to the national NRS standards. As part of that, we're developing the NRS CB21 crosswalk to allow some colleges to basically report course completion based on the CB21 level, also as a proxy for EFL. But that crosswalk's still moving forward and will be actually in better shape.
And then the last question, just to confirm, so these new elements that Todd was going over there in the presentation, are these going to be required, and when?
The plan is to add these for the 18-19 reporting year. So the first term that they would be reporting would be summer of 2018. And that report, that term reporting is due 30 days after the end.
Okay, and then I don't know, Randy, if you can see the last question about your response on the educational functioning level. Lisa B says, so it's based on testing then, educational functioning level, technically, but the way the crosswalk committee is working, I think there'll be multiple measures involved, correct?
Well, so for testing educational functioning level, or for reporting that, providers, if you're not WIOA Title II funded, in which case you have to use CASAS pre and post testing, you'll be able to use either an approved testing instrument, one of the NRS testing instruments, or completion of CB21 levels below transfer. So if they complete the course that basically aligns to, you know, D or whatever level that is, then the crosswalk will allow you to identify what educational functioning level that corresponds to in terms of being able to identify what they've completed. So it doesn't have to be testing, depending upon whether or not you're WIOA Title II funded. You can always opt to use testing. So that's out there for anyone to use to kind of capture student progress.
Okay, and then if someone had a technical question for Todd's unit, what's the best way to contact somebody? Is that Todd, or is that is there a help desk or a particular person that's on non-credit? What's the best way?
Yeah. For data submission questions or issues, there is a help desk. It's MIS edit, MISEDIT at CCCCO.
So MIS edit, and it's all lowercase, right? Okay. MIS edit at cccco.edu. I'm going to post it right now. And that's for what type of question?
That's for MIS data submission issues.
Okay. Then Andrew says this is for data definition, not submission. The issue I have is with the thinking or the process taking place. Who would he talk to?
I mean, they can still submit.
Okay, is it okay to put your email address out there, Todd? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you got one person typing. If there's any additional questions, feel free. We have a few minutes. Okay, and then I posted Todd's email. All right. Was there any other things that, I know we had additional slides, but anything important in those additional slides that you wanted to reference, Randy, before we see if there's any additional questions?
I mean, what's in the additional slides are really just the definitions that are in the report for the 7 program areas. So Neil, those are the slides you use as well. So and for the data elements. And so yeah, I would probably just, my recommendation would be that everyone kind of just take the time to kind of at least peruse that report on those elements. And then if they have further questions, please feel free to submit those vis-a-vis the AEBG website so that so the TAP can distribute them to either myself or Jay or Todd or whomever to be sure we can get your responses. I will say that in terms of the way I've been constructing responses to questions we've got so far, it's both to address not only the definition but kind of the intent that was sort of under the process, because I think a lot of the questions researchers are going to have about what are we really trying to capture here, which is obviously often as
and there's a question from Paige, and maybe we could clarify. It says our college uses acupuncture assessments for non-credit and is not NRS. So when we're talking about assessments for NRS, those are for measuring student progress, not measuring or assessing for student placement. So there's a big difference there, and I don't think acupuncture measures for student progress, only placement, I believe.
So typically, placement exams are used only for initial placement into the appropriate level of math, English, or ESL course. You can use whatever instrument you want for that. So as you said, the NRS instruments are designed to measure student measurable skills gains. So if you're using the same instrument, you know, you can measure how students have progressed, standardize how you're capturing it. We haven't considered any other testing instruments related to that sit outside the NRS. And there's a pretty large list there. So I would recommend that folks maybe go to NRS and take a look at those.
Okay, and then I might have missed this one, but Liz submitted a request. There is a specific need out there, especially for researchers, to have a crosswalk from MIS to the TE third-party import-export files. And so I'm not an expert on this because each college uses, in some cases, a different local attendance system. Wouldn't that crosswalk vary? So if you're using Banner, Datatel, PeopleSoft, Colleague, that would all have a different crosswalk to TE, correct or not? And that's the data mapping that CASAS has been working with?
So our lay understanding of this question is that the data extraction process, how you're pulling the elements out of different MIS systems, whatever your ERP is, looks quite a bit different depending on the vendor you're using. This would have, we have to kind of get together with CASAS to really kind of talk that through a little bit more. I think the crosswalk that's out there is between basically CASAS and MIS. How the different placement instruments sort of look like in relationship to that is
yeah, I think so. What CASAS has been doing with the help of some of the researchers, like Andrew Carter, did mapping from his attendance system to TE. We have people that have done it for Colleague, Datatel, PeopleSoft. There are some experts around the state that have done the data mapping, and so if you know what local system you're using, I would contact CASAS, and they might have the data mapping already done. And I think that is what Liz is talking about. So I did do a webinar on the 18th with Richard Ackerman. We kind of, high level covered this, but the best thing to do is contact CASAS. Specifically, if it's an import-export crosswalk, I would contact Richard Ackerman. And maybe we can get Richard's email. Maybe Daryl can find that, and we can put that in the chat as well. Because he is their TOPS Pro programmer head guy that could facilitate that crosswalk and give you the mapping that has already taken place, or connect you with somebody that's already done that. And has exported it. Okay, so Liz says she has already contacted Richard. They do not have mapping from MIS to third-party export files. There is only a mapping from CASAS forms and MIS. So we'll probably have to research that and get back to you, Liz, on that one and find out what the issue is. Okay. And Liz has put a request into AEBG TAP. No reply yet, so we'll follow up on that as well. Okay, so any last words, Todd or Randy? Pretty much.
Nope.
Done. I'm going to make a copy of the chat, and we'll follow up on some of those questions that we didn't answer today. Look into getting back to Liz's question and seeing how we can meet her needs with that crosswalk. And Melinda, any on the evaluation, did you want to close with any instructions?
I sure do. I'm just going to remind everybody that when we close the room, the evaluation page will open up for you. Please, please, please take a few minutes and thank you in advance for filling out that evaluation. It's used as a resource not only to improve future webinars, but also to find out what we can do in the future for you. We hope to see you all at future AEBG TAP webinars, trainings, and presentations. And on that note, everyone have a great weekend.
All right, thank you, Melinda, and we appreciate all 115 or so of you that participated today. We look forward to hopefully having more of these. And if you're interested in credit colleges, we'll be on at 12 o'clock to talk about how those credit colleges fit into the AEBG framework, and we'll be having practitioners on the line from 12 to 1 today. So thank you so much. Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Melinda, and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.